Nabeel I know very well, and lots of my research has stemmed from his work, and I think if I can just paraphrase, your work has been about celebrating agency, and he has such a keen eye for finding agency in all of the smallest places, and through that celebration growing that agency from individual to group to local government to larger in all different kinds of societies. That's a little paraphrase.
Very good, Mariah, yes. Could you do it again? It's very good.
I'll find another one as we go along. Lesley, thank you for coming. You're the rather 7-month head now of Restore. And so Restore is an initiative that gives vulnerable people, including homeless people, a chance for work and employment and involved in voluntary work. You're going to tell us more about Restore. Yeah. Okay. So I have a question that I guess it's not answerable, as we were sort of talking about before, but Nabeel's work looks a lot at the global south and finding initiatives and this special, what he calls small change, this agency, celebrating it and helping it to grow. And essentially looking inside of global south situations. And when we think about the local situation, and I think the big change from the film to today is the question of land. So the film focused a lot on housing. But how do we look for small change in the context of today? And the vulnerable people inside of very wealthy societies like Oxford, many of whom also have physical vulnerabilities. What do we do? How do we move forward? And if you want to correct your introduction, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, I'm Lesley Dewhurst, and I've worked in the charity sector in Oxford for just over 30 years, and principally running charities that support very, very varied vulnerabilities within adults. So mainly homelessness and mental health. And in fact, the thing I was going to correct is actually Restore, that I currently run, is an Oxfordshire charity that supports people specifically with mental health problems. Okay. Actually, it's not a homelessness charity. So it's working with people who've experienced significant mental ill health and helping them recover from that period of illness, specifically through employment and work-related opportunities. But prior to that, I worked for the last 15 years in Oxford Homeless Pathways, which used to be called Oxford Night Shelter. I was chief executive there for a long while, up until 2 years ago, working with specifically with homeless people. Before that, I was running an organisation called Elmore Community Services, working with people with complex multiple needs. So I suppose that the thread throughout my working life has been working with vulnerable adults and homelessness, mental illness, addiction, offending, all those sorts of things which can really derail people in their lives. And to kind of give a bit of context to today's work, seeing the effect on people of having those sorts of issues in their lives which have sapped their confidence, sapped their self-esteem, and inevitably have changed significantly their housing. Because when people become vulnerable in the way that I have described, through addiction, through ill health or disability, very often it is their housing situation which suffers, either because their family find it very difficult to support them, or because they leave that situation because of their mental unwellness, or because they become poor because they have no income, because they can't work, and therefore their accommodation either they lose completely or become so substandard as to go back into that vicious circle of loss of confidence, loss of self-esteem, loss of anything to do with identity. I think it's interesting seeing that theme of identity today, that when we think about where we live and our own front door and the friends we can invite round, or the freedom that gives us, or the capacity to be on our own, or the capacity to just feel safe, if that is gone or threatened or substandard, the effect that that has on our lives. And I think that in all of the organisations that I've ever run, our role has been to help people with that recovery in whatever they're trying to rebuild their lives from. And we can do so much to support them around that. But if we can't help them with their housing, then fundamentally they are going to be stuck in that recovery journey. Fortunately, most of the people who restore support actually tend not to be homeless, but in my previous lives and previous work, that hasn't been the case. So I'm very interested in this theme and delighted to be part of any discussion we can have today, which will be fruitful.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought, just to add to that, there's recent research out of the Disability Trust out of Leeds and also the University of Toronto that a significant proportion of people who become homeless suffer a head injury just before. So that's it's very strongly linked to issues, mental health, and yes, reveal.
Thank you. Yeah. The film for me was very interesting because it came after quite a difficult project that I was running with the GLC at the time, the Greater London Council, working with families, council tenant families, designing their own homes, basically. So we were on the same track, as it were. But what struck me about the film and about Walter Segal's work, and certainly what struck me at the time, talking about the small change thing that you mentioned, was that these were catalysts, and you could see it in the film, catalysts, small interventions that had huge strategic value that had to be kind of understood. And you can't understand that unless you institutionalize the principles behind Walter Segal's work, the stuff that I was doing, and so on. Unfortunately, the very institutions that support this kind of work, councils as we saw them, were undermined. And in my case, for example, 1978, when I left the country after my second project in London, the councils were really not exactly wound up, but diminished. Margaret Thatcher came in and we had the whole right to buy and all that sort of stuff. So to me, the difficulty of going to scale with small interventions that are great catalysts like Walter Segal's is how do we institutionalize them? How do we, if you want to use the word sustain them, if you like, and that's another word for it. And that's political, that's economic, that's environmental, it's a whole series of things. And the institutions that actually help us do that are being undermined themselves politically and financially. And so what's in their place? Even the housing associations that were taken over were undermined in those days. Just another quick comment, which I found very interesting from the film and through my own work. I didn't realize when I was working with families designing their own homes that at the same time and in parallel, the strategic agenda was that those families were getting together in all sorts of ways and creating a sense of community, changing information, sharing knowledge. We had little handbooks that the families would take away and they'd come back to the GLC. We had surgeries before we actually started on site with models. And they would take sometimes those little manuals to school. One of the mothers was a teacher. She got the kids to actually work with the manuals, cutting out bits of paper and furniture to make their own homes. So the whole information grew and grew outside of just the housing became a catalyst in the widest sense. And just one other amusing factor from the film, you saw Walter Segal's model, where he was putting the little slots into the slatted. That's how I started with our models when we were doing our first research in Battersea. And every time we took this model in, families would say, yes, I don't really like grids in my floor because we're going to have a fitted carpet. So no, you're not. This is only a model. Yeah, no, but grids, the carpet won't. And in the end, we actually, even that level of communication had to change. We had a little steel kind of plate, well, it's a metal plate on the base of the model. We had magnets on the panels that we could shuffle around, and that was much more understandable. And then when we were actually working on sites, once we'd got the model sorted out, we'd go to the structure with a piece of chalk and map it out. And then to go, that's not quite the room that I wanted, and so on. And it's amazing how the needs of most families were not great. They were not huge. When I was working with a mother and her daughter, for example, and wanted a two-person flat, they'd been on the waiting list for I don't know how long, because most two-person flats, standardized, come with a single double bedroom. And that didn't work for them. And so that was the level of detail that gave them a voice and an understanding of what they could have. So it was a fantastic experience for me. But did it continue? Does it continue? In principle, yes. All sorts of ways, but not actually in the way that we'd hoped.
There's a significant number of changes that have occurred. I mean, in the rules and regulations, and Sue, we were talking about the actually available land. So the key here was irregular land on a slope that Lucian wasn't interested in. That doesn't exist. I mean, that would be gold right now in London. So, I mean, how do we find the small change possibilities?
Well, I'm sorry, just to put in, but I'm not sure really, given the weakness of our public institutions in this particular field. And, you know, if we're talking about a rights-based approach to housing, it's the right to be able to decide what's right for yourself, which is the voice that we're talking about and all the details you saw in the film, which means the right of access to resources. And again, you saw it in the film. That's resources of knowledge, information, materials, money, land, all of that stuff. And I come back to the model that I've always used in this business, which is my P's model. Yeah. In order to provide whatever it is you're providing, you've got to figure out what it is you're trying to enable, right? And my immediate response from most architects will be, well, what do you mean? I'm providing a house. Yeah, but what does the house enable? And that invokes dear old John Turner's old adage, which is that what a house does is equally, if not more important, what it is. In teaching skills, building a sense of belonging, generating income, giving access to loans, all that sort of stuff. That's equally, if not more important. So how do we generate that in that sense? So before we actually figure out what it is we're providing, what is it we're trying to enable? And then you can go back and say, well, actually what we're providing is, it might be not a house. It might be land, it might be money, it might be materials, it might be skills, as you saw in the self-build. On the other hand, in some cases, where we're not trying to neutralize that into one single solution, because some people can't build themselves, it may be a house, because it will enable people to have some sense of security beyond that. So, you know, and then my A in the P's model, how can it actually be changed? How can it adapt? And we saw that again that was part of my work and still is. And actually that sounds very obvious, but in convention for architects is resisted. Change? No, we want to keep it as it is. We've done it, it's finished. Yeah? There's an old wonderful Arabic saying, I think, that goes, once a house is finished, the likelihood is that its occupants will die. In other words, it's never finished. The house is never finished as such. And then, of course, the S is sustained. How can we keep it going? You go back every time, or sustain, or have we provided enough or too much? Perhaps we need more money, perhaps we need political support. That's what we need to provide. We need new institutions, institutional capacities, and that sort of thing. And that goes round and round and round. I'm saying too much again.
No, that's really good. I mean, what's interesting now, the Community Land Trust, Community-Led Housing Group, and Transition by Design, who put the session together today. You could talk a little bit about what the challenges are in getting this movement forward. The ideas are great. People coming together to get land. The question really is about land. And putting cooperatives together, the ownership schemes, getting the mortgages.
I want to say a little bit about
Yes,
that.
please do.
Sorry. Since Maria's introduced this.
Yeah.
So this film today is part of a bigger study that Oxford City Council have asked us to do. So I'm from Community First Oxfordshire. We're working with the Oxfordshire Community Land Trust, Sue and Charlie, and Transition by Design, Katie's here. A whole collaboration to try and look at alternative solutions to the housing crisis in Oxford. And so wonderful, inspiring examples where the authority and the land and the community all come together and make something happen. It just doesn't happen here now. And we've been given the challenge really to think about why. Why can't community-led solutions and alternative solutions be possible here? We think they are, we think they're viable, but we're very interested to know how much interest there is in these sorts of approaches. Now, how about a show of hands here and now? Who would love to live in a house that they've designed, they've built, and they manage?
Yeah.
That's great. And we're talking about self-build as one example, and that's a lovely example, but it's the broader range of options than that. So there's housing co-ops. Kindling is a recent one in Oxford. There's community land trusts, like the one is being started in Oxford now. And there are self-management, tenants can self-manage their own social housing. There's co-housing where the design is by the people who live there and everybody owns their own private bit, but there's lots more shared facilities. So the reason we wanted to put this film on today was just to show one inspiring example and also say to you, come and talk to us if you're interested in this stuff. We are really trying to work on it, but we're battling against lack of institutional support, lack of land, high prices. You know, the challenges are really huge. So it's lovely to have this input from you today.
Yes, thank you.
Can I just add to that?
Yes, please do.
I just want to respond on behalf of the Community Land Trust to say that actually what we're trying to do is actually build mixed communities, because what's happening in Oxford now and in much of the country is that land is so expensive, houses are so expensive, that ordinary people can't afford to live. Never mind, I mean, homeless people are an obvious group, but actually there's all of those people in between, the people who keep our city going, you know, the bus drivers, the policemen. Those people can't afford to live here. And so one of the big reasons that I'm working, you know, I use all my spare time to do this, is because I think the only way we're going to have mixed communities is to somehow get this model to stick, where land can be taken out of the speculative market and actually held in perpetuity for permanently affordable houses. So one of the things that they didn't maybe do in Lewisham was that those houses that were actually quite cheap to buy are probably incredibly expensive now, because there's been no way of anchoring those houses into some kind of permanent affordability. And also, just to finally say, the land thing, there is quite a bit of publicly owned land, and I know it's not a small change, but it is one place where we could try and do something. If we could get a policy change to try and give community groups the first right to access publicly owned land when it is being sold, then that would be something. I don't think community-led housing is going to be a huge part of the future solution, but it's definitely a very important and significant part.
Yes. Katie?
Just to add to that about the expense and integrating that into the housing, a lot of the children who now live in the houses can't afford to stay there, so they have had to move on.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that in a lot of the innovative housing developments that we come up with, and even just looking in the contemporary era right now in Europe, we're responding when there's absolute pressure and we have no other option. Now this generation, millennial and before, will find it very difficult to afford housing, and not necessarily that the need to own a house is the most important thing. But of course, security and access to your community, all these things that make up life, that make up home, we were talking about. And there's two interesting examples now because of the high influx of refugees in southern Germany and in Sweden, and two wonderful examples, actually, which I think will start to inform how we make housing, is the cohabitation. So first-year students living with refugees, and the impacts are profound and multiplied. So also for mental health value for people coming from trauma situations, in terms of drawing from the possibilities for growth of different communities coming together. But as a kind of, being from North America and seeing the exact same issues happening, we're looking for hopefulness from other countries, from other situations in Europe and beyond. But how would we as individuals make the first step? Like, what do we do? We're the most willing people here. We're interested in putting the time in to be informed. What do we do? What could be our next steps?
I mean, just to throw it open, throw it out.
Yeah.
I think there are enough examples out there for us to pull forward as options that one would like to consider, and that our role might be able to look at those options and ask, well, what are the trade-offs between? If you go this route, here are the trade-offs, financial, political, and all the rest of it. And that does engage us, not just in the grassroots, but actually in the political system that controls the land supply, that controls standards and all the rest, that controls the financing of housing and so on. I mean, I do remember one of the greatest difficulties with the self-build when Walter Segal was doing his stuff and when we were talking about it at the same time, was how do you get a mortgage for a house that's not finished? And so you had to put capital towards it. And of course, that's where the council stepped in and provided that, one of the principles behind it. But that wasn't then sustained. There weren't lending institutions that stepped in and said, well, look, yes, part of our role is to help and assist in the self-build process, which means incrementally lending money as such. And that's the risk that you take at the same time. So, I do think it would be absolutely great to bring these examples that we already have and ask what principles are embedded in them and what would it now take to move forward with some of them as options available to us. But that, again, I find, I studied as an architect. Is that my role to become political? I no longer worry about it, by the way, but I used to worry about that a lot because I used to sort of say, well, I like designing houses. Yeah, but that's okay. You can carry on designing houses. That's not the really important part of it to some extent. But it does require us then to get off our pedestals and say, well, if you're interested in housing, you've got to be interested in more than just houses.
I'm really right with you on that one. Thinking about the current times of austerity and the lack of money, the lack of land, the lack of so much politically as well, that people then look to others, to look to the government and look to the politicians to come up with solutions, and that idea of the institutionalising of small examples that have worked. How do you marry that up? The thing I really got out of the film, apart from of course that wonderful look at social history around smoking and special brew and flares. How can you build with all those flares on? I don't know. Anyway, I thought it was a great film, but it was that thing about the way that the community came together and clearly how that group of people felt so empowered by having the opportunity to come up with their own solution. And I thought that was wonderful, because that is, working with vulnerable adults, as soon as you can give people something that makes them feel they've got some control and gives them the chance to have choice, the opportunity to do something for themselves, the change and development is absolutely staggering. And that's where the strength of those sorts of solutions come from. I'm a great believer in small solutions, and certainly in Oxfordshire, working with a whole series of everyone's quirky, but quirky people with quirky problems. You don't have stock answers for that, and you don't have stock answers for their housing either. They're always like little solutions here, there, and everywhere, and you can ferret away and find those. What worries me is that in this particular climate, this particular lack of money, all we can do is look for something that's going to be a big solution for something, and that ain't going to happen. So I like that way that we can look at the smaller solutions to make things work. As to how we do that in Oxford, as
a catalyst. In other words, so long as one recognises that it is the intervention, that it embodies ideas and all the rest of it, that do then need to be scaled up, and the strategic agenda is to do that. And the question then is, how do we do that?
I've got a question. I don't think it's an immediate issue, but I think it's something that needs to be taken into consideration from the very start. And how do we make sure that these community-led solutions are truly inclusive? How do we make sure that prejudice or certain maybe stigmas don't influence the actual membership of these groups and cooperatives?
I was interested in the film. They talked about how we all help each other. There must have been some discord. I don't know, do you know more about that? What about the people who weren't pulling their weight, the ones whose house got way behind, the ones who overused the power tools? I mean, there must have been stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we certainly had that with the community as it grew. And my project's in Adelaide Road. And that was part of the task of managing, or mediating it, as it were. But that emerged for me out of working with individual families. As I say, that was one of the strategic and wonderful things, the growth of community as such, to the extent that the council in the end allocated a flat that they used as a community centre for quite a while. And then it became a cooperative before it disintegrated. But I think the key in these respects really is to kind of understand who it is, because one of the things about self-help that does have a stigma is it's only for those who can't afford to buy a house properly. And therefore it needs to be integrated into the housing options routes as it were, as a legitimate and status-enhancing solution, as it were. And that again means taking a political stance on it. I think it's also, certainly as I remember, reducing the dependency that is implicit in people. It's not, it's council house, it's their responsibility to build. I remember doing my surveys in Battersea and sitting in the living room with the family, talking with the model, and these kids would charge into the living room, and every time they charged in, the door would squeak, the hinges were squeaking. It got really annoying. And I went, put some oil on the hinges. And the guy went, yes, we've been waiting for the council to come and do that for the last 3 months. And it's just this sense of lack of ownership, lack of responsibility out of years of dependency in that respect. I think we've got over that now, but then we now need to move forward in that respect.
I think there'll always be sort of inequalities in these relationships. And even, I mean, to some degree, when we look at community land trust too, and we compare it to people with mental health issues, not everybody has access to make that choice to participate. But it's as much about balancing what happens with authority, with the big governing bodies, and balancing the power of developers, essentially, I think. And then inside of that, there's smaller mediation. I think the disparity between people who can get involved is less, but there will always be people excluded. I think it's being aware and trying to improve that model all the time.
You'd say you worked in housing for decades, am I right?
Myself?
Yeah.
Yes.
How has
Decades is a very polite way of describing it.
throughout the years, especially with the UK leaving the EU, which will change a bit of legislation and laws, was the EU good or bad? There are many factors to account for in relaxing this red tape for housing.
I'm not sure. I'm not so up to date with the housing situation, I must say, here and in Europe, because most of my work has been since the London days overseas in international development, slum improvement programs and that sort of stuff. So I'm not too sure what the impact of the European Union is, in fact, on the housing options that we have available to us. I don't know if anybody else has a background on that.
I'd like to respond quickly by saying I think we managed to screw it up all by ourselves. And actually the EU might have had a moderating effect if we'd allowed it to. There's a lot more equity in the housing market in Europe, although there are pockets of inequality all over the place.
And to add as well that actually a lot of countries in Europe are doing housing much better than we are. There's a lot more options, particularly places like Germany, where alternative housing is not alternative, it's the norm.
And Denmark.
Denmark, yeah.
There's something about cultural expectations, isn't there, as well? That in this absurd idea that we have in this country that you're only successful if you do own your own property, and that is going to have to change. It really is.
Yeah.
I'm going to unashamedly ask for some free advice. I've recently started a 3-year action research project in Oxford, working with people with a lived experience of homelessness to create new housing strategies, community-based housing strategies within the city. And I thought your question was a really interesting one, and this idea of who's able to participate and to what level are they able to participate. And certainly participation for some people who are experiencing a precarious moment, or indeed a precarious people, and will always be precarious people, means very different things for them. And I wondered from your experience, using the Global South more as a methodology than a geography perhaps, what some of your experience could teach us about how to design this system so that this...
Well, absolutely. I was talking earlier, I think, about the work that I was doing in Sri Lanka over many years, the Million Houses Programme, where it was clear that the needs of different communities were different, both for ethnic, cultural reasons, but also in terms of finance, in terms of rural, urban, and a whole range of political and other issues. And up until then, the Housing Authority in Sri Lanka was searching for a way of doing social housing. And the conclusion we came into the end is to understand those differences and come up with what we call the housing options and loans package. In other words, there were different ways you can go. Each of those ways had different trade-offs, and that they had also different criteria for borrowing money. Housing options and loans, so different loans to different people and so on. And that resulted in all sorts of site and services programs, incremental housing, urban upgrading where the houses existed already. There were cooperatives, there were land trusts. What I found absolutely fascinating out of that is that also, working with communities, it empowered others, because of the voice, to take initiatives that otherwise they weren't taking. So there were, for example, all kinds of very small thrift societies, families borrowing $1 a week to buy basically food and all the rest of it, from a thrift society of about 8 families, that sort of thing. That was then federated and became the Women's Bank in Sri Lanka, which now turns over not quite as big as the Grameen Bank. So there were spin-offs as a result of voice. There were spin-offs as a result of that. And that gave even people who were living in these very poor areas incredible status, because they were part of a large corporate bank to some extent in that respect. So I think there are lessons there, and we took those lessons when I was teaching in the States. Some of those lessons we actually brought to the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, which is what it was at that time, looking at ways in which we can engage communities to build, self-build as such. And quite a bit happened. Small sites that developers weren't interested in that were then taken on by the Massachusetts Housing Authority, and quite a number were built. Some self-built, but others just built affordably for others. So yeah, there are lots of lessons like that to learn. But the support of the reason that Sri Lanka and a few other examples I can give you worked is because there was an incredible political support for it. In Sri Lanka, the Minister of Housing was also the Prime Minister, Premadasa. For all their politics, it's something else. So, and that's the status that we were able to bring to local organizations that enabled that to happen. It wasn't an activist position. It wasn't sort of saying, look, government, you're not doing well, stop doing that. No, you're doing great, but let's do it slightly differently. And therefore, with that status, you get people to listen and things change. And they also they were going bankrupt with their housing program.
He talks about it in this book. And incidentally, for comparison purposes, Sweden has a 1 million house project as well.
Oh, does it?
Yes, and I've never heard them make the correlation. But if you look at the policies, essentially they lift bureaucracy in local authorities where there's the highest pressure for housing, and then they inject support to accelerate. And there's very similar things to what happened much earlier in Sri Lanka.
Very interesting.
So you can see there's a transferability.
Yeah, absolutely.
As the pressure increases.
Absolutely.
Decrease housing stuff.
No, that was learning, from the south to the north rather than the other way around, which is what we're used to.
Yeah.
You listen to me and you'll be okay.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
I think in terms of getting back to the kind of the vulnerable issues that you were talking about with the people you're seeing within the homelessness sector, it's the same in any area of so-called disability of mental health or physical health or addiction or anything like that, that at the point of crisis, those people, all you can see and all they can see is the thing, I am somebody who is mentally ill, I am somebody who's a refugee, all of these things that I'm not saying being a refugee is a disability, by the way, obviously, but it's that you get labelled by the presenting issue that is blocking things. And as soon as you can get people themselves and others around them to see past that, then they say, but actually I worked for 25 years as a carpenter, and so in terms of your self-build, actually it's all coming back to me now, and I can actually teach some of you to do that. And as soon as you can get people to take away that initial presenting issue and get into the things that they have inspired them and that they have as skills of their own, then that's where the strength is.
Absolutely, and I just add to that's the assumption certainly I've made internationally, and that is all the resources you need are already in place. Yeah. It's an assumption. They may need to be tapped, helped along and so on. So the result of all of this stuff was that actually it helped generate employment in the local area. And they were partnerships. In other words, it wasn't sort of saying, we'll make all the decisions for you, now build your own house. Well, no, they actually became partners to the housing authority. social enterprises that were part of a network of organisations that could build not only for themselves, but for others that couldn't build for themselves. So it was not a big organisation in that way, as big insofar as its network was concerned. And that's again something to learn here. That we've lost the ability, again, because of our lack of institutional capacity, to network. And again, I come back to sort of saying, look what we've got. It's enormous, it's wonderful, but it's fragmented. It needs institutionalisation. And that's, be careful of that word, but nevertheless.
Yes.
I'm just thinking about this idea about how we can maybe move things on, particularly in a place like Oxford. And the examples from Sri Lanka and Sweden are very much when the push has come from the top and the politicians. But I think I don't think it's all doom and gloom. It's really difficult. And I think it's important that we think where these spaces are at the moment, that we can find and then we can create and then we can make bigger in terms of enabling these sorts of things to happen. There's new funding initiatives and community share offers, for example. There's possibilities around that. Up the road there's Build, a self-build project in Charwell, which has got self-build options from decorating the walls to just getting a plot and building it. And then there's thinking about where we can push some policy levers as well, both locally and nationally. And so this idea of fragmentation, basically, as well, to try and get around that idea of fragmentation. But I think it's finding where there are some opportunities to bring together land and finance and strategy. Those are the three things that you need: land, finance, and the political will to get something done. So, I mean, hopefully the report that Fiona's talking about will be one step of identifying some of that policy space and bringing people together around that policy space and creating some of those openings.
Apart from supporting academics and activists, really, in the world, do you think the university has, as an institution, has a role to play in helping to institutionalize these movements? Is that too political?
Well, I certainly do.
That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly believe completely in that. I mean, again, one of the reasons that our program in Sri Lanka and Cairo and Peru happened was because of the status that MIT brought to their situation. As Oscar will know. And one can be embarrassed about that. On the other hand, one can use that status and say, look, I'm not embarrassed about anything. So long as one's ideals are properly located and positioned as such. And so long as you're not actually going around just telling people what to do. So there's a lot of empathy that's a part of that. And that's part of the skill, I suppose, that we should be cultivating in academia. Rather than the other way around, because I was not, I was told I was the decision maker. I had to be in control. You want a house? Leave it to me.
Do you mean as a practitioner?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Just to pipe up, the universities in Oxford are also developers.
Yes.
They also have enormous housing needs for their students, their researchers, their lecturers.
Yes, and we've seen where that's been applied occasionally, haven't we? Yes.
So, I do think there's a role for the big employers of the universities to think about different ways of providing housing.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Is this film available on YouTube?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Katie and Sandra.
My reflection is that as well as thinking about the institutional framework, we need to think about the kind of long-term sustainability and of those frameworks. And Fran mentioned the issue of the kind of in perpetuity concept. So, a couple of examples that come to mind thinking of institutional frameworks are the building society movement in this country were self-build groups. That's what they were. And over time they changed, and then they ultimately demutualised, and we're kind of now where we are, that there are very few mutual societies left. Another example is the whole community housing association movement that came out of particularly the late 60s and early 70s, there was a massive movement of new family-orientated associations, very much a reaction to Cathy Come Home. And now what's happened is most of those associations don't exist any longer. They've been gobbled up by the regional and national players. And now, you know, that kind of relationship between a local association and a local community and the notion of a population that it serves, you know, has been eroded. I mean, there are still there are associations, a network called Place Shapers, which has got associations in it that are more connected to communities. But by and large, a lot of those institutions have gone in the way that they were in the past. So there's a whole issue about, yes, if you create an institution and you upscale and you create bigger programs, do you then set in train a sort of mechanism that turns it into something that's different? It becomes not what you intended in the first place. How do you keep that kind of mission and purpose still locked in? It's a big challenge.
Well, it has to be organic, doesn't it,
Yeah,
then?
I know.
And that's the bit that's impossible to build in to a formula, but it's something that we all need to kind of keep vivid.
Yeah, because in a really unitary culture, both economically and politically, that's a real challenge. You know, if we lived in a more decentralised and diversified society, it will be possible for small local things to develop, complete, flourish and be sustained.
Yeah.
But it's much harder here because everything's pulled upwards.
And it's much harder in a political environment where there is no view to long-term planning because everything is such parliamentary 5-year cycle geared.
Be interesting to see the Walter Segal close, if those houses are still there and how much they cost now.
Yeah.
And who lives in them. So I guess some things are out of control, but the processes should always be as inclusive as possible. All the way. So so are we good? Yeah? Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you so much, Lesley and Nabeel. Thank you so much for being here and helping to propel this movement forward. These are actually the ways we're helping each other and coming together, creating more small change. I have to mention a couple things. So 2:30, the Suryat Borders Artists, Refugees, Syrian Women and Children in the Glass Tank. At 5 o'clock back here, there's a tragic comedy play called Borderline. It's about refugees. And at 7:30, back in the JHB Lecture Theatre, is the film Outside, The Other Side of Hope, followed by a talk with the director. So thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you the rest of the day too. Thank you.